This isn't just a cemetery, it's one of Berlin's most conflicted historical sites. Generals, Luftwaffe aces, and noted civilians, as well as a few infamous Nazis, are buried here. Founded as a final resting place for disabled veterans, the Invalidenfriedhof would become a shrine to Prussian heroes, a stage for Nazi propaganda, and eventually a casualty of the Berlin Wall. And since reunification, efforts have been underway to reclaim some of this lost cemetery. And in this video, I'm going to take you on a short tour of Invalidenfriedhof. I will also link to a self-guided tour that you could use if you visit, or you can hire me, Steve from Experienced Berlin Tours, to take you around. Okay, let's dive in. First, a very brief history. In 1748, King Frederick the Great established the Invalidenhaus, a home for wounded veterans. And remarkably, much of that building still exists today, but now it houses federal office buildings. The Invalidenfriedhof, or Cemetery of the Invalids, was created alongside it. It was intended to be a modest burial ground, mostly for soldiers and family members who died while living in the Invalidenhaus, but things would evolve. This modest cemetery became more prestigious as officers. Some even commandants of the Invalidenhaus were laid to rest here. And in Section A, which is the land originally laid aside for the cemetery, you will find some of these early commandants of the Invalidenhaus. This includes a group of sarcophagi of the late Baroque period that were only rediscovered in the 1990s. These graves are richly decorated with inscriptions, ornaments, symbols of death, and some with coat of arms. These are the exceptions, as the favorite style of the cemetery burials moved toward neoclassical early on, such as this standout, a tall pedestal topped by a shield and a Prussian officer's feathered plumed helmet. In fact, just a short stroll through the cemetery will bring you to a variety of grave markers, with all types of symbols and symbolism. By the early 1800s, especially in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, the cemetery began to attract more status burials, and no other burial was more important than that of Gerhard von Scharnhorst. Scharnhorst wasn't just any general. He was one of the founders of modern military reform in Prussia, helping to create a system of merit-based promotion and national conscription that would define 19th century German warfare. He was instrumental in bringing Prussia from the brink of complete annihilation toward its eventual victory over Napoleon. Scharnhorst would be reinterred here from Prague after a royal decree in 1824 officially designated the Invalidenfriedhof as the resting place for distinguished Prussian military personnel. His dramatic memorial was designed by Karl Friedrich Schinkel, who also designed Berlin's Altes Museum and the Neue Wache. It's a more classical design featuring a stone sarcophagus lying on top of two stone pillars. The sarcophagus is decorated with scenes of battle, presumably during the campaigns against Napoleon's France. And on top of the sarcophagus is a sleeping lion sculpture, designed by Christian Daniel Rau. Interesting, the lion was cast with captured French cannon. Buried alongside Scharnhorst, inside the iron fencing are family members. And surrounding the Scharnhorst family plot are the impressive tombs of other officers of the War of Liberation. And it's in this section that you can get a sense of what the larger cemetery might once have looked like with fenced-in family plots. But it wasn't just military figures who were laid to rest here. By the mid-1800s, Invalidenhof also became the final resting place for prominent civilians, such as theologians, entrepreneurs, and hospital staff. But also for common folk, the artisans and employees of the Invalidenhof and their families. On a walk through the cemetery, you will stumble upon graves like this one for the nurses of the nearby Augusta Hospital. After the First World War, Invalidenhof and the cemetery ceased to be military institutions as part of a general demilitarization of Germany. But new burials continued, and one of the first major post-war burials was in 1925, when the remains of von Richthofen, the legendary Red Baron, were reinterred here from France. As Germany's most famous flying ace, his new grave became a national shrine. Today, this is just a memorial stone. His remains were moved one final time in 1975 to Wiesbaden, to the Richthofen family gravesite. Hermann Göring, who once served under him, personally commissioned this stone memorial, which returned here in 2017, bullet holes and all. And just steps away from von Richthofen is a less famous German pilot. This is the grave of Marga von, who was buried here in 1933. A pioneering female pilot, she was the first woman to fly solo from Berlin to Tokyo. She took her own life after crashing in French-controlled Aleppo on a failed mission to Cape Town. It was later revealed that she was meant to facilitate illicit arms deals on behalf of the Nazis in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. The Nazis seized on her death and turned her into a martyr of German sacrifice, offering her a heroine's burial here at Invalidenfriedhof. Also nearby are the gravesites of two more of the Luftwaffe's most famous aces. Ernst Udet was a World War I pilot who notched 62 confirmed aerial victories, second only to von Richthofen. Following World War I, Udet became a stunt pilot and airshow celebrity. But in the 1930s, he was recruited by the Nazis to help build up the Luftwaffe. He would become the director of air armament and later chief of procurement and supply for the Luftwaffe, but he felt scapegoated by the regime for the failures of the Luftwaffe to fully meet the early demands of the war. In 1941, overwhelmed and disillusioned, he died by suicide. Just steps away lies Werner Mulders, one of Nazi Germany's most celebrated fighter pilots. He was the first Luftwaffe pilot to surpass 100 aerial victories, and he became a national hero. Mulders died in a plane crash in 1941 en route to attend Udet's funeral. Both state funerals were used by the Nazi regime as major propaganda events. His grave was placed here as a symbolic continuation of Germany's military aviation legacy, right alongside figures like Udet and Richthofen. But there are two infamous Nazis whose remains still lie within the cemetery, and you wouldn't accidentally stumble upon their graves. In 1941, Fritz Todt, one of Hitler's top engineers and the man behind Germany's massive Autobahn, was buried here. During the war, he became Reich Minister for Armaments and oversaw military construction projects using forced labor, up to 800,000 people. His funeral was a Nazi state affair, and his body was interred here just steps away from Scharnhorst. After the war, his grave markings were removed during the process of denazification, though his remains are still below the ground. Some years ago, somebody, likely a family member, installed a commemorative stone, but this too was removed. But an even more chilling Nazi figure was also buried here. Below this simple, low-lying, unmarked gravestone lie the remains of Reinhard Heydrich, a top SS official and one of the chief architects of the Holocaust. He organized the Wannsee Conference and was head of the Reich main security office. After his assassination in Prague in 1942, Heydrich was given a full state funeral and be buried here in Invalidenfriedhof. After the war, his grave marker was deliberately removed, and in 2019, grave robbers dug open his grave under the cover of night, but reportedly removed nothing. To this day, no one knows for sure what they were looking for. I'll leave a link to a video from Mark Felton, where he speculates quite persuasively that the robbers were after a sword and some medals. It's a fascinating look into the black market of Nazi paraphernalia, and it's due to Heydrich in particular that Invalidenfriedhof gets labeled by some as a Nazi cemetery. But in actuality, only a handful of Nazi officials were buried here. And their burials were always intended to be temporary, with their final resting places being inside of the Nazi Hall of the Soldier. Among the more unexpected figures in Invalidenfriedhof is the grave of Colonel Wilhelm Stehle, the last commander of the Invalidenhaus and a secret resistor to Hitler. He was arrested in mid-1944 for his ties to the Sulf Circle and the July 20th plot. He was executed by the Gestapo in April of 1945. Against all odds, Stehle was granted a burial here, the only known member of the anti-Nazi military resistance residing in this cemetery. His grave still bears his name and is one of the few visible reminders of the moral complexities buried within these grounds. And throughout the cemetery today, you will see what certainly look like bullet and perhaps mortar marks on gravestones. Some were undoubtedly left here as reminders to future generations. Now, while I couldn't find confirmation that fighting took place within the cemetery, it did sit right in the middle of the routes that the Soviet Red Army took en route to the Reichstag. And I published a two-part series on places to see for the battle scars of the Battle of Berlin in World War II. I will leave a link to these videos in the description and comment section of this video. After World War II, Invalidenfriedhof lay in ruins, bombed, overgrown, and largely abandoned. The cemetery was used for one of the many mass graves for civilians and soldiers who died during the last days of the war. And there's a commemorative plaque acknowledging this mass grave, whose location, from what I understand, has been lost. In the years that followed the Second World War, the cemetery fell under the Allied Control Council, a joint administration by the US, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union armed forces. Though it sat in the Soviet sector, all four powers oversaw the denazification efforts here. By 1948, the Allies had banned public ceremonies and ordered the removal of Nazi symbols and militaristic inscriptions. Some gravestones and tombs were removed, especially those for the likes of Heinrich and Tut. And throughout the cemetery, particularly where Tut's grave was located, are areas where grave groupings have been completely removed. I suspect that many of these grave sites did once hold Nazis, but on a recent tour, I was informed that this isn't necessarily the case. When the Cold War hardened and the city split for good, Invalidenfriedhof came under full control by the East German government, and its slow erasure began. The cemetery was officially closed in 1951, and most grave markers older than 25 years or in poor condition were removed. When the Berlin Wall went up in 1961, the cemetery took its biggest hit. It suddenly found itself on the front line of the Cold War. The canal just behind me marked the border between East and West Berlin, and the East German regime saw this area as a potential escape route. To secure it, they had about a third of the cemetery leveled. Entire rows of graves were bulldozed. And in this image, you can see what parts of Section F, one of the affected sections, once looked like. Mausoleums, monuments, and even century-old family plots were all removed to make way for a patrol road, barbed wire, floodlights, and watchtower. And according to the cemetery's website, 94 tons of monuments, as well as 26 tons of gravestones and 3 tons of grave railings were all dismantled and removed. You can see the remains of railing posts throughout the cemetery. And some graves were relocated, but most weren't. The remains beneath were likely left in place. And from what I understand, the small part of the cemetery that remains today owes its survival to a bit of East German propaganda. The GDR government wanted to preserve the graves of General Scharnhorst and his contemporaries because these Prussians fought alongside the Russians in the defeat of Napoleon. And in this tower hangs the Augusta Victoria Glocke. This bell is the last surviving piece of a church that once stood just beyond the cemetery walls. Gnadenkirche, or the Church of Grace, was a Protestant church in the nearby Invalidenpark and often held funeral services for those who were buried here. The church was severely damaged during World War II and eventually demolished by the East German authorities in 1947. Of its 3 bells, only this one, named after Empress Augusta, was salvaged. It was eventually placed here, not randomly, but along the old funeral route from church to gravesite. The cemetery was largely off limits to the public during the GDR years. A section of the original inner wall, the wall that faced East Berlin, still exists in situ. And the Berlin Wall Trail, a walking and cycling path that traces the former border route along the city, runs directly through what was once the death strip. And one of the wall's most tragic incidents took place just steps away from the cemetery. In May of 1962, just behind me, along the canal, 14-year-old Wilfried Tooth attempted to escape East Berlin by swimming across the canal into West Berlin. The East German border guards on duty here opened fire on the teenager as he swam, striking him a dozen times. But he survived. West Berlin police returned fire. In the exchange, one of the border guards, Peter Göring, was fatally wounded. The East German regime declared him a hero, but to much of the world, it was a tragic reminder of the human cost of the Berlin Wall. And if you'd like to learn more about this affair and its aftermath, check out the recent video by Johnny from Whitland's Berlin Tours. It takes a deeper dive into this fascinating story. And just north of here, you can still visit a preserved East German watchtower, now the Günther Lifton Memorial. Günther Lifton was the first person to be shot dead by GDR troops as he tried to flee to West Berlin 1 year earlier, just days after the wall was built. His brother turned the watchtower into a memorial site after reunification to ensure that the victims of the wall are never forgotten. Following Germany's reunification in 1990, efforts to restore Invalidenfriedhof Cemetery began in earnest. Only roughly 200 tombs and gravestones remained at that time. The cemetery was immediately put under monument protection. In 1992, the Verein Invalidenfriedhof, or the Invalids Cemetery Association, was created to assist government efforts to restore as much of the cemetery as reasonably possible. Walking paths were remade, walls were repaired, trees were planted, but most importantly, grave markers were restored or replaced. And you can visit the cemetery on a public tour like I did. I took an excellent tour through Beyond and Beneath Tours, which runs an English tour a couple of times a month in the warmer months. I will leave a link to their website in the description below. Now, keep exploring Berlin with this video here, where I visit locations in Berlin where damage from World War II can be seen. Or check out this playlist on Berlin travel tips. And I'll see you in the next video.